handle our podcasting here at Healthy Gamer. So we started Healthy Gamer a few years ago to really bring mental health resources to the internet. And as a result, we started streaming on Twitch, started streaming on YouTube, and now we're going to be sort of working with Yogscast to talk a little bit about, to help us with our podcast. And we're actually going to start with hopping in with Pyrion Flax, who is also a member of Yogscast. So let's just hop in. Okay. Yo, Pyrion.
Hello.
How are you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, I did an hour and a half podcast this morning, so I'm warmed up. I'm ready to do some more.
Beautiful. And what was your podcast about this morning?
Oh, just the usual crap. You know, we just chat. We do two kinds. We do like one where the three of us just talk, and one where we answer emails from viewers. And it's kind of dependent on what quality of emails we get. So, but it was a fun one.
Cool. And so you've been, which podcast do you do?
The Triforce podcast, it's called.
Yeah. And so were you guys answering emails today?
Yes, but we don't really answer them. We just kind of read them for our amusement. It's not like it's not it's not like people are coming to us for answers. So yeah.
And so I think we're going to be like chilling for maybe an hour or two. Is that right?
So I think we have to stop at 2. Because I think there's a stream after that. So we'll just chat for like 45 minutes or 50 minutes or whatever. Cool.
And what do you want to talk about?
Whatever you want. I mean, I wrote a list of all the things that I'm suffering from that maybe you can help me with.
Okay.
You want to hear the list?
Sure, let's hear it.
All right. Anxiety, imposter syndrome, feelings of worthlessness, bouts of uncontrollable rage, mood swings, burnout, writer's block, competitiveness, difficulty focusing, hyperfocusing, depression, excessive drinking, night terrors, panic attacks, and a constant fear of death.
Okay. Were you joking about that?
Which one?
Any of them? All of them?
Some of them. Yeah,
okay.
Some of them. I do have a constant fear of death. I don't know if that's common. I'm 47, so I've started worrying about that a lot more.
Yeah, so you want to talk about that?
Yes, I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because if you look at like these ancient yogic texts, they say that like one of the key ways to attain enlightenment is to actually conquer the fear of death. And I think it's called Abhinivesha. I'm blanking on the Sanskrit, but yeah. So what scares you about death?
Well, what doesn't? I mean, who wouldn't be scared of death, I guess, is my question. I suppose the thing that I'm really can't get my head around is the idea that it's possible for there to be nothing else. Because I'm an atheist, so I to me, death is definitively the end. And the fact that there's just the lights go out and you don't even know it's happened. It's just, it is over. And because I can't even imagine that, I find it scary.
What is it that you can't imagine?
So I know I've read a little bit about this, and I know that someone said that you can imagine the time before you were born because you can see pictures of it and all the rest of it. I can imagine life going on without me, but just the moment where the lights go out, the switch from you are alive to you are dead would be so terrifying in that moment, knowing that it was coming, that I just lie awake at night thinking about that last moment.
Okay, so I think this is we can do this. I feel
okay.
So I think a couple of these things are sort of like fundamentals. So just as a simple example, if we think about, you said you can't imagine the time after you die, right? So let's assume an atheistic frame for a second, which is that there's no heaven, there's no soul, nothing. You don't believe any of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay, totally fine. So, but let's start with this. So if you have a fear, like if we think about fears in your regular life, how effective is imagination at dealing with fears?
I find that sometimes if I'm worried about something, running it through in my head first, like a rehearsal, kind of helps me plan it out and think about what I would do in that situation. So, like if I have a piece of work where I'm going to be live, for example, when I went to I did a Dota event this year where I was hosting it, and I found that just spending some time thinking about what I was going to do, planning it out, thinking of stuff that could go wrong and how I'd handle it, helped to put my mind at ease. But when it comes to thinking about death, I don't want to think about it so much. So really planning for it or trying to imagine it makes it worse. So
right. So I'm with you there, but let's think about things in your life that you're not afraid of.
Okay.
Right. So I understand you're a parent. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you afraid of being a parent?
No,
Okay.
we wanted to be. Yeah, we wanted to be. I mean, I was a little, anxious that I'd mess it up or anything like that. But I suppose, I fear something happening to my kids, obviously. But I would say that that's my greatest fear. But yeah, it's. I was not afraid of being a parent. No.
So when you're afraid of something in life, I'm hearing that some amount of thinking through things can help alleviate anxiety. But I would guess that most of the things that you're comfortable with, you're not comfortable with because you imagined them. You're comfortable with them because you experienced them. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good point. Yeah, like familiarity with things makes them less scary.
So if we look at
yeah.
sort of like what is the source of fear and anxiety in our brain, it's the anticipation of problems in the unknown, right? So we just don't know what's going to happen. And once we start to have experience, let's say like Dota, for example, I'm afraid of playing a game of Dota until I play a game of Dota, and then I'm more afraid of playing a game of Dota.
Yes, that's it. And also deeply regretful that you played a game of Dota.
Right? So I think a key thing to understand is that as we go through life, like experience is actually the antidote to anxiety, not imagination. What do you think about that?
I think that's fantastic. But I suppose the problem is that does mean you can never alleviate a fear of death, because to experience it would mean you were dead. Or do I just surround myself with death?
No, yeah. So that's it's a great question, right? So now that we know, okay, let's like take a step back, and this is the kind of the path that the yogis took, right? They're like, okay, so basically like experience is the foundation of knowledge. Like you can pretend, you can imagine, you can hypothesize.
Okay.
But ultimately, like you have to experience things. And so then there's a very natural problem, which is that you can't, so presumably you can't experience death. So there are a couple of things that are pretty interesting. One is that we have actually very good scientific accounts of people who have died, and even their perceptions of death during brain death. So and we even now know, like there's been a couple of cases, these are really fascinating from a scientific standpoint, of people who were hooked up to EEGs. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Can you explain it to us?
Is it the thing that, or is that an ECG, which is the one that measures your heart, or is the EEG the one that measures your brain waves? I can't remember.
Exactly.
Which it is.
Actually, they're both right. So an EEG is the same device for your brain as it is for your heart. So what it does is it measures the electrical activity in your brain. And when people die, there's actually a paradoxical hyperactivity across all of the regions of your brain. And so this kind of a subjective experience of life flashing before your eyes is kind of, like that may be part of why people subjectively experience it that way. The really interesting thing is that I've met more people who are traumatized by the return to life than they are to death.
Wow. So people who were dead and then they revived them.
Yeah.
And that was traumatizing.
So there's like, I don't know if you've heard of this like light at the end of the tunnel business and like the sense of peace and whatever. So like it's kind of interesting, and it doesn't help us because we don't know exactly how to do that. And I'm not advocating that you die. We don't have to. There's other ways.
Thank you.
But like the interesting thing is that we have reports from people that like death ain't so bad, that it's actually life that is like more painful than death is. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, man. Depends on the day of the week and what's happening, but yeah, I can feel that. It's interesting. It's still, I'll try not to think about it too much. Is that still a reasonable approach? Just don't think about it, or is that just burying the problem?
I think it's a reasonable approach, although I don't think it's going to solve your problem.
Okay. So maybe death ain't so bad. would you mind if I like read some stuff about this for my own sake and maybe did some stuff like that afterwards?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Do you want to
Thank
talk
you.
about something else,
Uh,
or you want to keep talking about this?
No, I don't want to talk about death anymore.
Okay.
That's okay. All right, so I'm sure this is a very common thing that you get asked because you deal with people that do what I do for a living and all the rest of it. And you've dealt with much, much, much like bigger streamers and stuff. So for them, it must be even more intense. But how do people deal with anonymous criticisms or sort of hate, if you want, that sort of at times seems to you can just ignore it and you carry on as normal, and then other times you just kind of can't help yourself but read it and kind of get buried in it, and it can really affect your mood and stuff like that. I mean, that must be a common problem for people that do what I do.
It's very common. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is that anonymous criticism. So our brain was not designed for the numbers of the internet.
Right. Yeah.
So if you kind of think about like the standard human being and how our brain evolved, we evolved in a society where we maybe knew like 300 people.
Yeah.
And so if you kind of think about like even if half the people that you knew hated you, the amount of venom that you could receive on a daily basis was like absolutely smaller than if you're a streamer.
Right.
So the first thing is that the brain doesn't scale the same way. So if 5 people say really nasty things about you, that used to be really, really impactful. Like if I just know 300 people, but now if 5 people say nasty things about you, your brain is stuck on this number 5, and that 5 is like too many, or even a single person is too many. So this is a really common problem, and I think it's just because our brain did not scale for the internet. And so even a tiny minority of people being very upset with you is enough to disturb you because that's the way that your brain is wired. If 2 or 3 people in your tribe of 300, if 2 people really, really hate you, that is a dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's going to trigger anxiety, and that's just the way it works because our brain does not think in terms of probabilities. Like that's just, we suck at, as human beings, we suck at probabilities.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
You know, there are lots of experiments where people will say like, okay, would you rather have a 50% chance to win $100 or would you rather have a 100% chance to win $40 or something like that?
Right,
you can do some weird probability experiments, and humans, generally speaking, don't do a good job.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing to consider, though, is that, and there's even evidence that, like, I don't know if you've experienced this, but when I stream on Twitch, I find that messages are flying by so quickly that I don't have time to read them. But if someone says something nasty, my brain selects it and presents it to me for conscious appraisal.
Yes.
So that's another thing that's really problematic, is that we have circuits in our brain that filter information. So, for example, right now I notice that you have many books in your background, but I'm not paying attention to them.
Right, right.
But my brain is still receiving that sensory input and filtering what it raises to conscious awareness.
Okay.
Okay? So, and this is the key part that we can control, because we can't, it's hard to rewire our brain for probabilities. Like, you can sort of do that. But the key thing is that what your brain consciously chooses to give you can be shaped. So based on, you kind of said on some days you're okay and on some days you're not okay. What do you think is the difference?
I think part of it, if I've been streaming a lot or I've been working a lot, I tend not to take a lot of time off. Like I stream pretty much every day, and it's for a long time, like hours and hours and hours. I see people streaming for like a couple of hours and then they're just done for the day. Whereas I was playing, you know, that meme, Dr. K, that's going around that's like, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? You know, that,
yeah, I
that
heard
meme?
something. Somewhat, my wife asked me that question and taped me while she was asking it, and I was like,
yeah. How often do you think about the Roman Empire, just out of interest?
I would say once every like 3 months.
3 months, okay, all right.
But,
so at the time that it was like came out, I was playing a game set in Rome. Like, you're trying to lead Rome to defeat Carthage and all this kind of stuff. So it was just funny timing. But either way, I was playing that game a lot, like 10 to 12 hours a day, streaming it. I was all in on this. I was obsessed. And when I've been doing that for like a couple of weeks, like really streaming a lot, I feel like the fatigue, the mental fatigue of doing that means that those negative comments hit a lot harder. Whereas if I, just getting back into, so I take a bit of time off or whatever, I don't notice it. So it's almost certainly just that I'm just kind of worn down.
Yeah, and that's precisely correct. So if we look at like that cognitive filter, okay, what the cognitive filter does is protects us from negative stimuli. So it's sort of the we've got two, we're just going to divide your brain in half, okay?
Okay.
You've got your primitive brain, which has a lot of your emotional circuitry, your survival circuitry, those are the same thing, your danger circuitry. And then you've got your frontal lobes and your cortices, which are like what makes you human.
Okay.
And over time, what tends to happen is as we get fatigued, the human parts of our brain shut off. And the more primitive parts of our brain are like unchecked, right? So if I'm playing my 8th game of Dota in a row, I'm going to start flaming people because that impulsive animal part of me like lets loose. And we sort of see this in cases of dementia as well. So like as people develop dementia, the higher order functions of their brain and their cortices start to shut off. And so people will become paranoid. They'll become very fearful. And that's because these deep parts of their brain that generate the fear signal are no longer balanced by our cortices. And fatigue does the same thing. Because
does that mean then that the animal part of our brain is just always ticking away? But what makes us human is not that we've just sort of our brains have evolved so they're all better. Some of it is still the stuff that we had in us from all our evolution through being more animalistic. We've now arrived at this point. So as we get tired, why are those bits shutting down first? Are they more expensive in terms of like energy usage or what?
They're more expensive in terms of energy usage, yes. But the bigger thing is that if you shut one down, if you shut off your cortices and you have your survival centers intact, you are more likely to survive than if you shut down your survival centers and are like a philosopher of the Roman Empire.
Right, okay.
Right? So like literally it's because one is worth more in terms of survival than the other.
Oh, interesting.
And if you sort of think about like, let's say like you're watching a horror film, right? Or your mid is feeding, let's say.
Okay.
And then like
I don't just play Dota. Like I
just play Dota, so that and you've got a TI thing, and that's how I know you.
Okay.
So, So anyway, if you kind of like look at a horror film, like if you sort of think about the times in your life when you're really in danger, the human parts of your brain actually like stop working, and that's part of what we want. Like if I'm walking through the forest and I see a tiger, I don't want to be like start thinking about the nuance and the philosophy and like, whether the tiger is like, whether the tiger has a soul or doesn't have a soul. Like it's time to act, and you want to act in a very primitive and survival kind of way. And as we get fatigued, like our human functions kind of shut down, and that amygdala is left unchecked.
Wow. All right. So I got another question for you then, because I find that when I play most games, I'm generally, if anyone in my chat is watching, they might disagree, but I'm generally pretty chill. I really do think compared to when I play Dota for sure. But there's something about Dota. Is there an element where when I'm playing a video game like Dota, which you think this is high level brain stuff, I feel like I'm so focused on some inane task like last hitting a creep or, something like that my personality regresses to a fairly, at times, unpleasant and grouchy person because I'm so focused on Dota. And that could be my first game of the day, and I'm fresh as a daisy. But if certain things go wrong, I get unreasonably angry.
Yeah, so I think it's not. I think your answer's in what you just said. So what makes you unreasonably angry? Is it playing Dota, or is it some things in Dota going wrong?
It's generally my teammates in Dota, which is obviously I can't control what they do. I am terrible at Dota compared to a lot of the people that I play with. I'm sure I'm just as frustrating. I know I shouldn't get angry with some of the terrible players I play with, but sometimes it's just like, how can you be that bad that you just have to press one button and they just can't do it, and it's kind of frustrating. But
Yeah,
I know that's not who I am.
That's not related to Dota. So if you look at the number one source of suffering in the world, it is thwarted expectations.
Gosh, I thought you were going to say my Dota games.
Nope.
Whew, that was close call.
Yeah, so if you look at like, people like the Buddha, they kind of notice that, okay, where does unhappiness comes from? Like unhappiness comes from having an expectation and having people not live up to expectations.
Okay.
And that's true of like pro players as well. And so even when I work with like pro players, like a big part of it is like, let's try to understand what our expectations are. And the more that you can manage, and I don't mean just lower, I mean really understand how expectation forms in your mind. Because an expectation is an entitlement to a future that you don't actually have, right? Because you expect it. So it's like, this is supposed to happen.
Right.
And so I think generally speaking, human beings, and you've got kids, so maybe you kind of know this, that like, if your child expects to, if you tell your kid, yeah, you can you can stay up half an hour and watch like one more episode, and then 5 minutes later you come in and you say, sorry, we're not going to do that.
Right.
And if you had said
lose their minds.
Absolutely. And if you had said, no, you can't watch an episode, it's bedtime in 5 minutes. Even though the scenario is exactly the same, the level of frustration that your child experiences is like completely different.
Yeah. Tell me about it. Holy cow. So can I ask you a question about fairness?
Yeah.
Because I've found that when I think of my kids and how they've grown, they're 14 and 11 now, and so they're much easier to look after in some ways. In other ways, it's harder. The problems that they've got are not so simple. They become more complicated as their lives become more complicated. But one thing that they have always, and I don't know if this is just siblings or this is just all kids, but I would say if I had to think of something that children are obsessed with, it is a concept of fairness. And they are obsessed with fairness. That's not fair. It's like, why did she get this and I didn't? Where does that come from? Is that literally like the baby birds in the nest, like vying to get the same amount of food so none of them gets pushed out as the runt? Because they seem born with an idea of fairness. That's how it feels.
Yeah, so I think they are to a certain degree, and this is where there's also some really interesting psychology at play. So the first thing is that if we look at the emotion that is associated with fairness, it's anger, right? They don't get sad, they don't get guilty, they don't get afraid, they get angry.
Yeah.
And so if we look at the evolutionary purpose of anger is the emotion that we have to protect our territory. It's like how I protect what is mine. So if I were to, like, let's say, shove you or slap you across the face, I have violated the territory of your body, and your most natural response would be anger. So we're absolutely, as human beings, there's a part of us that, like, if we're pushovers and we don't keep the integrity of our boundaries intact, then we'll get taken advantage of. So that's absolutely evolutionary. The second thing is that fairness is fundamentally psychologically a problem of ego, because the problem is that there are things that are happening to you that are fair, but they don't seem fair. And my kids are the same way. So for example, like one of my kids has a moratorium on screen time at the moment. And so she'll say, like, it's not fair that my sibling gets to do screen time and I do. And we say, actually, it is fair because your sibling behaves differently from the way that you do.
Right.
And so if we kind of look at like what's going on psychologically, our ego is active. And the problem with the ego is that it doesn't look at things fairly. It's fundamentally, it's subjective. It's biased. And so this is why I think we run into so much problems with the kids perceive problems with fairness, because the instrument that they're using to measure fairness is biased. It's not actually their intellect or their analytical capability. It's their ego.
It's just me, essentially. Like, why don't I get?
And so as you help them develop intellect that is stronger than their ego, then their ability to understand fairness will get better. Because when I kind of work with my kids, it's like, okay, let's take a step back and understand, like, why is this way? Why is this way? Let's understand why we're doing this to you. It's not an arbitrary punishment. We're here
Right.
to help you. How do you feel when you do less screen time, et cetera, et cetera. And then as you kind of like, as they start to step away from their ego, and there are even like meditation techniques and things like that that you can do that'll shut off your ego. And as your ego shuts off, then you're able to see things more clearly.
Interesting. So, another thing I'd like to ask about is where do you think, and this is kind of tied to ego, when it comes to playing games, which obviously I do a lot, I tend to play multiplayer games more than single player games. Do you think the desire to beat other people in games is either what I tell myself, which is I find those games more challenging, more varied. Sometimes you'll win easily because the other team just play like crazy people. And but when you win against people, it feels like it's worth more than when you defeat a computer, which isn't adapting to what you do. You can figure out its flaws and stuff like that. Is that ego looking for a win over people? Is it ego to want to defeat other players?
Sometimes, but I would say probably not. So if we look at why people play games, there are different ways that games interact with our brain. So there are absolutely people that I've worked with, and I tend to think of this a little bit more as like video game addiction, where if there are some people I've worked with that are so far behind and have gotten bullied in life that they feel really bad about themselves. And what happens when you get bullied is like when someone makes you feel small, you learn something, which is that, okay, the way to feel big is to make other people feel small. Since this person is big, I'm small. So I can just reverse that, make someone else feel small, and I can feel big. So there are absolutely, there's a great group at University of Toronto that looks at personality analysis and which games people play. And what they discover is that the kind of person who plays Legend of Zelda, their personality is different from someone who plays like, these battle arenas like Fortnite or PUBG or whatever.
Right.
So there are intrinsic personality differences. Sometimes that has to do with ego. But my guess, so do you find single player games boring?
It depends on the game. There, I mean, I play strategy games and stuff like that quite a lot. Or, I just played Baldur's Gate, for example, and it was brilliant. I loved it. That's a single player game. I'm gonna play a multiplayer with some friends of mine. But it's like, it was brilliant. But it was a story. So it's more like a journey through the story. I loved the narrative and the story, and it was challenging for sure for me. So I really enjoyed that. But if I play Dota against bots, even if I win, it doesn't feel as satisfying.
So that's probably because there's a certain part of our brain called the reticular activating formation, which it governs our wakefulness, alertness, and engagement. So this is also a primitive part of our brain. But when we're like, if you're playing against bots, you're not engaged. It's not about dominating or not dominating. It's like, it's like you're playing through a tutorial. There's no skin in the game.
Right.
And so if we look at what activates what gets us engaged and alert, which will then result in things like dopamine and stuff like that. But I think there's way more than dopamine, which is the biggest problem in gaming. Is it's like everyone's like dopamine. There's all kinds of other parts of your brain that are active. So the level of mental engagement that you have, which is the opposite of boredom, by the way, right, is also governed by the reticular activating formation. And that part is going to be like activated by a certain amount of stress. So if things are too easy, then they're boring. And the way to actually get more engaged is to increase your stress level. And so one thing that happens when human beings compete against other human beings is your stress level physiologically goes up because you can't take it for granted. It's not like a walk in the park.
Right.
And so once your stress level goes up, which is what happens in PvP games, you get more stressed. And then once your stress level goes up, your engagement goes up, your mind is more attuned to the game, you stop getting distracted, your enjoyment increases, your dopamine increases. And even if we look at the single player games, we have to get engaged with them. So sometimes single player games engage us because they're stressful, like if BG3, if you're playing on, tactician versus whatever, and there's a hard battle. The other way that we get engaged is with story, right? So we activate our emotions, we get caught up in narrative, but that's why I'm kind of pointing to the RAF, because that's the place where narrative and competitiveness they will both activate the reticular activating formation, which is ultimately what creates our engagement with the game.
Wow. So when you talk to pro players and stuff, this is something I've heard a lot from, like, I'm into football, like soccer, and one of the things you hear from retired pros is they talk about how, I guess this is true of most sportsmen actually, is that for them the fear of losing was much greater than the satisfaction that they get from winning. That the pain of losing is so miserable, and when they win, it's just like, oh, thank God! Like, it's just a relief. Is that a common thing in esports players as well, where they're just so desperate to not lose? That's the feeling they're chasing.
Well, I can attest to this. So it is absolutely true for some players who win a lot. I'm not going to name names, or it's their place to say, but I think that there are definitely some players that used to lose quite a bit, and they hate it so much that it inspires them to work hard. Now, in my experience, that is not the best variable that correlates with winning. So I think that if you really look at the best Dota you can play, or any other game, you have to really enter a flow state. So if we look at the science of performance, it's entering a flow state. And entering a flow state, you can't have any thoughts that are not related to the game at hand. You can't think about, oh, I hate losing, I don't want to lose this game, or we're going to win, we're definitely going to win, this game is easy. You can't have any meta level thoughts. You have to just be playing the game, and to be playing the game kind of mindlessly, not thinking about winning, not thinking about losing. You can try to win and try not to lose. So like squeezing a win out of a loss, absolutely. But you really have to be 100% focused in the game.
Yeah.
I think the fear of losing is a very, very good motivator that helps people stay consistent with their practice between games. The problem is that the fear of losing, if you don't control it and you don't learn the right skills, which I think the people who end up winning tend to like figure this out kind of on their own, or they work with someone who teaches them these skills. It can lead to a lot of things like disappointment, expectation, toxicity. So those feelings can be a very powerful motivating tool, but if you're not in control of them, like if you fear losing and then your teammate makes a mistake, like you make mistakes, your teammate makes mistakes, and that turns into blame, even if it's deserved, that's not healthy for your team over the course of time. So this is where I'd say that like having faith in your teammates, even loving your teammates, having a bond with your teammates is a really important piece of that puzzle.
Interesting. Going back to what you were saying, obviously you've got kids, so you're I would assume far better equipped to manage the relationships and the difficulties that they're going to have as they're growing up, because you're already describing quite a positive way of explaining fairness and stuff like that. Did you think it was going to be easier than it was because of your training? Or has it proven to be easier than you thought it would be? Or has it proven to be harder than you thought it would be?
So I think it's a very common thought that if you are professionally trained in human behavior, like if you're a therapist or psychiatrist, raising kids is easy. I'm not so sure. So it's very, like, I've seen a lot of kids in my office as patients who had psychologists, therapists, or psychiatrists as parents. So there's actually a possibility that, if we look at like the way that we've evolved, being hyper like into the mind may actually be a disadvantage, because instead of just being an angry parent or like a regular parent, I'm some fucking hyper cerebral kind of like psychoanalyzing my kid, and that could be damaging.
Right.
So I try really hard to not be a psychiatrist with my kids, and like people are maybe surprised by like my behavior with my kids because I'm just a parent. So right. I actually like very intentionally will try to lose my patience with them at times if that's really authentically what I'm feeling. So I don't know. The short answer is I don't know whether it's better or worse. I think I would actually attribute my spiritual training to being like a better advantage for my kids than my medical training. So like teaching my kids to meditate and then like helping them understand like, okay, like you expect, like, so I had a kid, one of my kids went to a birthday party and she was disappointed because her two friends there were playing with other people.
Oh man, yeah, that's a tough one.
And so, she said, I want to go. And then like, I think if I was a regular parent, I would have said, well, let's stay and let's work through this. But I understood exactly what was going on. And I was like, okay, if you want to go, like, let's go. Right. And then we talked about it, and I was amazed that she like understood the three principles that I explained to her. One thing I said is that, okay, so look at where you were sitting and where were your friends sitting. And there were basically two people sitting between you and your friends. So in that situation, you've got two options. You can move close to your friends, and then they'll play with you, or what you can do is make new friends with the people who are sitting next to you.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if I'm a better parent or worse parent because of it. I think we're gonna have to wait about 10, 15 years and see what state my kids are in.
But don't you also find it to be? I know this sounds sick, but I'm kind of interested to see what my kids are going to be like when they're older, even if I've been a dreadful parent somehow, and they're like, "Oh, you messed us up when you would play Dota in the evenings or whatever." Like, I don't know what effect really I've had on my kids. I like to think they're pretty awesome, but I am kind of also curious to see what are they going to turn out like. Like, I don't want to race there because I'm really enjoying them at the moment, but I know that when they're older, they're going to want to have less to do with me because I don't call my mum every day or whatever. But I'm also really fascinated to see what they're going to be like. But it's also, I feel like when they leave home, it's almost going to feel like I've lost them. Like I've stopped having my kids and now they're just some adults that I know. That's how I feel. And it feels like kind of tragic to me.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it sounds like that. I think that's normal. I mean, what's the...
I don't know. Other people don't seem to think about it. I just worry about it a lot. I mean, my kids aren't even about to leave home, but I'm just like, oh shit, they could be leaving home in 10 years, and I just kind of worry about it.
Yeah. So what is the consequence of them leaving home?
Yes, get a couple of spare rooms.
No, but when you say you're afraid of them leaving home, like what's the...
lack of daily interaction, I suppose, like not seeing them or speaking to them every day.
Yeah.
So it would feel like I've lost access to them, if you like.
Yeah. So I think that's completely reasonable. There are a couple things going for you. The first is that I suspect that your brain will be more okay with it a few years from now. So if there are parts of your brain that right now are telling you that it is very, very important for you to interact with your 11-year-old and 14-year-old on a daily basis.
Right.
And there are probably times where, like, if you remember when they were like 1 and 4, like your brain was like, oh my God, I can't let them be alone for like an hour. Right? I have to constantly be watching them. But you're okay with them being alone for an hour now.
Yeah, true.
Right? So as the child's needs change, the amount of latitude you will give them and how comfortable you will feel with them being away from you will also change.
Huh.
Now, there's some amount that you may just miss them because you like them and they're turning into cool humans. So there's going to be a piece of that. But I think some of it is like, they're going to be different people and you're going to be different people when they leave the house. 7 years from now, like, you'll have so much more confidence in their ability to handle themselves. You may have so much more frustration because you've like raised them through their teenage years and you're actually okay with them like moving out a little bit, right? So you have to remember that, and this is really common for parents, that we're always like afraid of the future.
Right.
But the thing is, our brain is calculating that future based on the information that we have now. Not the information. It's not based on who they will be and who you will be. It's based on who you are and who they are.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And I think it's normal to be afraid of and wanting to spend time with your kids, right? And then
yeah. I think it's funny because what made me think of it was when they were still quite little, we had some work done downstairs, and the builder asked us if we wanted to put a partition in the living room so that my wife and I would have one part, and there was another bit where we could like shove the kids and not hear them. I was like, why would you want to do that? Like, you know, I want to spend time with them. As they get older, starting to understand the value of maybe putting a partition in so we could just hear the TV or hear ourselves think, and, you know, all the noise that they make and stuff like that. So yeah, you're right. It was something that at the time was like completely alien to me. But now as I get older, I think, man, we'd love some peace and quiet. So gosh, I do kind of get that. It's kind of sad.
Loving these questions. These are fantastic, man.
Oh, thank you. All right. So I did struggle with something a few years ago. I had I think I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's called hyperventricular tachycardia.
Okay.
Which was my heart would race like 150, 200 beats per minute, like, and sometimes it would just stop, but sometimes it wouldn't stop. I've spoken about this before on the podcast that I do, the Triforce. So yeah, I would have to go into hospital, and they give you a shot of something called adenosine that basically stops your heart, and then they give you this thing they call the flush, which sort of flushes the adenosine out of your heart, and you're back to normal, fine. After the third time of having this in like 3 or 4 years, the doctor on...
Speak.
Okay, one sec. I think I'll have to tell TJ. Oh, there we go. We're back. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, I had the hyperventricular tachycardia attack. So I'd go in, I'd have the adenosine, and then I had the operation called an ablation where they fixed it, and that was fine. As you know, it was mildly traumatic, but it was fine. But then I started having panic attacks, worrying about that, and it's sort of like, even though I'm not worried about it anymore, they've kind of stuck there. So I'm worried that I've broken part of my brain after like several years of that and that worry. It's pretty much always when I'm trying to get to sleep, that's when it kicks in, because that's when typically I would have an attack.
What kicks in?
A panic attack.
Okay, and these started after you had specifically like the adenosine and stuff?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a fascinating area of research. So there are people who require devices implanted in their heart that will reset their rhythm if they have an abnormal rhythm, which is what hyperventricular tachycardia is. You can fix it by ablating. So usually what happens is you've got a part of the heart. So you've got a part of the heart called the sinoatrial node, and then you have this other part of the heart called the AV node, atrioventricular node. And these are the things that determine the rhythm of your heart. They tell your heart when to pump and how fast to pump. The problem is that sometimes you've got a piece of your heart that doesn't listen to them and creates its own rhythm. And then that causes all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So we can do two things. We can do an ablation if there is a focus in the heart. And the other thing is we can implant a device that if your heart becomes abnormal, it'll reset the rhythm electrically.
Like a pacemaker almost, right? Yeah.
The problem is that when that part of when that device kicks in, the subjective experience for patients is being kicked in the chest by a horse. So I have seen, and there's some research that anytime this device activates, it induces PTSD, like real diagnosable PTSD. So that what happens is you have such a negative physical experience that your brain activates your trauma compensation mechanisms. So what is trauma compensation? Hypervigilance. Oh my God, we've been attacked by a tiger 4 times. So the next time we go into the jungle, we need to be on high alert.
Right.
So this is where part of the problem is that, in a weird way, like I would say that this is very common, first of all. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not screwed up. It is a consequence of our brain's natural ability to adapt. And this is a case where I would even go as far as to say that even though you're suffering from this is not a part of your brain that's broken. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It is a part of your brain that is it's not just brain, your whole body is working exactly the way that it's supposed to, which is that it's supposed to help you adapt.
Right.
Because there have been experiences that you've had that have been life-threatening. And so now your brain and your body are like, hey, bro, let's not die tonight. And maybe
Right,
if
okay.
we're like a little bit more careful, we will learn, like we'll catch something that could be life-threatening. So that's the first thing to understand. Second thing is you can absolutely rewire some of this physiology. I'm actually doing a trauma workshop this weekend precisely that's going to cover this. Is that there are certain changes to your physiology which will induce panic. So what we also don't oftentimes get is that panic is not mental, it's physiologic. So when adrenaline and cortisol, norepinephrine, like when some of these things start flooding in our body, they will change the way that we think. They will change the way that we breathe. And there are absolutely techniques that you can do to kind of recalibrate those. Simple things are like meditation. But what we really want to do is increase something in your body called heart rate variability. So if we kind of look at your heart, it can go high, it can go low. Your heart has the capacity to adapt. So if you look at professional athletes, their heart rate variability is very high. Their baseline heart rate is really low. And then when they exercise, their heart rate can increase a ton. If you look at someone who's a degenerate gamer, their heart rate variability is lower because their baseline heart rate is high and they don't have a whole lot of like movement. So if you kind of look at it, your physiology is inflexible. It's kind of like you can't stretch it. And so what we actually want to do is, when it's kind of locked in and you have a low HRV, what that means is that you're prone to things like anxiety and panic and stuff like that, because that's the heart rate at which panic and anxiety and stuff sort of exist.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is that if you can increase that physiology of stretch, if you can sort of like learn to calm down your nervous system, which is the other way to do it, because right now your nervous system is wired in kind of a high alert state. So as you kind of rewire it to be in a more normal state, that hopefully will improve. And you can do everything from exercise to meditation to even doing things like, if you're starting to feel panic, you can, I've had some patients that this works for. If you exercise for 60 seconds, as hard as you possibly can. I'm not talking about like doing 5 push-ups. I'm talking about getting out of bed, stepping outside of your house, and literally running at maximal speed as if you were about to die. If you do that for 60 seconds, it triggers a natural calming mechanism. So this is what happens when we push our nervous system to 100%. Our nervous system is like, hey, we've pushed ourselves way too far. We need to calm down. And so it triggers like this parasympathetic nervous response. The other thing that you can do is you can dunk your face in ice water. That's going to trigger something called the mammalian diving reflex. So which will do the same thing. And then you'll trigger these parts of your physiology that will sort of like shut off the panic attack. So when we have people who are like acutely suicidal and like really want to hurt themselves or even engaging in self-injurious behavior, if we can get them to dunk their face in ice water, then we can avoid restraints, injections, all that kind of stuff. So there's like parts of your physiology that you can kind of trigger that may be able to help.
Wow, that's gonna drive my wife crazy. Run down the street, chucking cold water on myself. All right, well, that's interesting. I have been recommended both more exercise and meditation, so I think maybe that's something I should finally get around to. Those are better, yeah. Oh wow, this has been fantastic. I really enjoyed talking with you, dude. It's fascinating. You know all of these problems, and everything you said is really. It's not just like do this. I love the way you explain the physiological reasons behind it and everything. That was really something. Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise. And love everything that you do, Pyrion. Are you going to be at TI this year? Do you know? No
comment. We don't know. There's no talent announcements yet. I don't know yet, so we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, cool. Well,
yeah.
I hope things work out for you there. But thank you so much for coming on, and I'm love to be partnered with Yogscast.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's great. It's a great podcast. I love it. I want to listen to other people's therapy sessions now as well. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, we don't do therapy on stream, but
not therapy. Sorry, sessions. We'll just call them sessions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I did find this very therapeutic, so thank you very much. And
I'm glad.
We'll talk again soon, huh?
Take care, man. Bye.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.